Howdy everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today we are going to update our Mythic Plus tank tier list. So right now showing on the screen, this was our tier list that we came out with around Halloween, a little over 3 weeks ago. We are less than a week now from launch. We have seen a ton of tuning, giant changes with Druids getting like a 50% aura buff. We also had that 40% health increase and creature damage increase to kind of nerf healing, and that affect different tanks in different ways. And then we've seen buffs and nerfs to kind of level things out with the tuning between all of the tank specs. And right now, I can't actually say that, well, in this video, we're going to kind of nitpick between a few different things, and we're going to go ahead and rank the tanks. To be honest, tank balance is really, really, really good right now. And pretty much if you enjoy playing one tank over another, that's probably what you're going to want to choose as a main, as opposed to, eking out an extra little percent of power here and there and a little bit of extra defensive ability. Because really, when it comes down to it, if you're playing a brewmaster at a high level as opposed to a warrior at a mediocre level, guess what? Your brewmaster's probably going to outperform. So with that being said, we're kind of looking at each tank and really what we think are going to be the highest key levels kind of obtainable. Like when we look at where this tuning is right now and what keys they're going to be able to do, we're really going to have their top ranked tank being the one that we feel like is going to probably push the highest keys and then go from there. That being said, like I'm saying, all of them are probably within, a key or two level of each other anyway, and the tank tuning looks great right now. Let's go ahead and kick things off. I'll send it over to Kazi and let's talk about Guardian Druid.
Yeah, so we're going to start with Guardian Druid, and that's our most obvious change because Guardian Druid received some absolutely massive buffs. And for those of you who weren't following along, they received a 50% aura buff to all of their spells besides Moonfire. So you take pretty much any tank on this list, you add 50% to the damage, or literally any tank on this list, you add 50% to their damage, and suddenly they're going to be the best tank there is. And while this wasn't exactly 50%, it was definitely enough to bump Guardian Druid all the way up into S for us. They, in addition to the 50% damage buff, they got a buff to their After the Wildfire talent. And right now in dungeons, when we're starting to push up, it's not usually the tank damage that is the limiting factor for how big of pulls you can do and how quickly you can run through the dungeons. Yes, the tank needs to not just fall over and get one shot, but if you're able to survive, if the tank's able to survive, it's actually usually the group and party damage that's becoming an issue at higher keys. And right now, After the Wildfire from Guardian is a great way to address this. And this is that every time Guardian Druids spend 200 rage, they erupt in healing. At normal raid eye level, it's coming out for about 60k healing per person. So that's a pretty massive amount of healing going out. And it was recently capped at 5 targets, but that doesn't really affect our Druids in Mythic Plus, apart from maybe some interactions where pets are sniping heals here and there. So that's a really big quality of life thing where it did get nerfed, but it only came into effect the raid more so than the Mythic Plus stuff. So Druids also have some really good feedback in their kit. So they have Incarn, which is on a reduced cooldown, or that they're able to reduce the cooldown of by spending rage, and then that rage also goes into feeding into their After the Wildfire. So you end up taking a lot of the talents on the right side to really improve that damage, but also the rage generation. It has a really nice feedback loop, and their ability to help off-heal the party is something that's going to really set them apart. That, plus they have some of the highest AoE damage and probably the highest single target overall damage and keys, which is really going to benefit them as you get into those higher tyrannical keys. So we think that if there's one spec that we think might get nerfed going forward, it would probably be Guardian Druids, but as they are sitting right now, we think that they're probably the strongest tank and the one that's most likely to be pushing the highest to keys. So right now we have Guardian Druid at the top of S tier.
Yep, just 3 weeks ago at the bottom and now at the top.
Yep.
So it shows you that things can change. But stocks are up.
All it takes is a 50% buff.
Yep, that's it. All right, let's move on to Vengeance Demon Hunter. This one actually is going to go down into A tier. It's kind of fallen a little bit in a way. The 40% nerf didn't hurt this one as much as your soul consumption is based on scales with damage taken. However, kind of this leech and the frailty and this drain tanking style did receive a bit of a nerf, as leech isn't really as strong as it was, right? Let's see. Also talking about the spec, the frailty also was nerfed. I mean, that damage was cut in half. The bonus damage that you get, as well as the healing that you receive from the damage that you're doing. That being said, they're still in a really good spot right now. They're still extremely taking during demon spikes and during meta. They still do a great amount of like self-healing, self-sustain, and while it's not as strong as it was, it is still pretty strong. They also bring a lot of great mob control. Sigil of Silence is extremely powerful when you're getting a 9-second silence on all of your mobs. You're going to probably run the build with the extended sigils and the reduced cooldown on that. As far as the rotation in the piloting this tank, it is a little bit more difficult with the nerfs. Before you were kind of popping your health back up to full all the time, and you're kind of starting every time you're consuming souls, you're pressing Spirit Bomb, you're just back up to full health. Not quite there right now with the sustain, but like I said, it is still enough to hold its own. It's still great against magic damage. It's one of the best tanks against that, if not the best. They still have great single target damage, maybe not quite as good as Druid right now. And like I said, with the frailty nerfs, that did kind of hurt their damage a little bit, just brought it back down a little bit. But really, it's just kind of in line with a great sort of A-tier tank. Definitely not the worst, but in the top 3 for sure. There is a little bit of options that you have in the builds. You're definitely locked into frailty. That's going to be your strongest side of that talent tree down the left side. You're always going to take those. But you do have options with Fiery Brand build, which could work a lot better maybe on tyrannical weeks or dungeons where you have like a lot of mini bosses, things like that, like Ruby Life Pools. It's very strong defensive. You do give up a little bit of demon spikes uptime with that, as you're not taking Feed the Demon, and you do lose your cheat death as well. So that's kind of the trade-up that you need to think about when pushing some of these keys. But it does allow you to tailor your build to the key that you're doing. And I just think it's a really great all-around tank. It's fairly simple to pilot. And while it can be punishing, if you are not on top of your self-healing, the rotation really isn't that complicated, and once you get the hang of it, it's a pretty simple tank to pick up. Still very strong.
Yeah, they also bring Consume Magic for a Magic Dispel Purge that is actually really useful in a couple of dungeons, like Naku Defensive, where there's some stuff that being able to dispel is really helpful.
And Prism's still useful for certain skips. They do bring an AoE stun, so they have really good mob control with their silences and their purge. Yep. Good stuff.
So they've come down a little bit. We have them in A now. They did receive a slight nerf, but as much as anything, it's that Guardian Druid got stronger significantly, and Vengeance got a little weaker. So it wasn't a huge. It's not like they're a lot weaker than they were in October, but the tanks around them seem to be a little bit better spot. So moving on to Warrior, we had it at the top of S, and it's still going to land an S for us. Warriors just mitigate the absolute most damage of any of the tanks, and it's not particularly close, especially when you start talking about physical damage. And with 100% uptime on shield block, pretty much 100% uptime on ignore pain, they go into pretty much every single large tank buster with 100% health. And it's a lot easier to survive those big tank busters if you're coming in at 100% health as opposed to being chunked down to 80, 70%, something like that beforehand. Warrior feels tankier in battle stance than most other tanks do at all. That's not even accounting for the 20% damage reduction they can get from swapping to defensive stance when they need to. Warrior brings really strong party utility. They have 2 single target stuns. They have Shockwave. They have Intimidating Shout, Commanding Shout, Battle Shout. A lot of really useful things for your party, especially if in the melee meta that Battle Shout is going to be a little bit more stronger than it otherwise would be. Warrior's not the highest damage. They're behind Brewmaster. They're probably 4th, 5th in AoE damage, and not great, not the best in single target either. But they're competitive, and the difference between them isn't so large that you're going to feel like you're really gimping your party by bringing a Warrior. So if when we get into some of those higher and higher keys at the higher eye levels, if it gets to the point where it's more important, or where the limiting thing is whether the tank can stay alive as opposed to whether the party is staying alive, Warrior's really going to start to shine in those situations and likely overtake Guardian Druid for that top spot in the party, because they just are able to mitigate by far the most damage and really make the job of the healer a lot easier.
And if you keep in mind from where Warrior started when it was first designed going into Dragonflight, it has been nothing but nerfed. And it's still like pretty much the top level of tanks. And I'm feeling like it's probably going to stay there. I don't think they're going to do much more to prot warrior going into the expansion launch here. All right, so let's talk about prot paladin next. The editing on this might get a little weird because we had previously recorded this video, and then moments later after we were finished, we actually saw some brand new buffs to prot pally. So the buffs look like this. It's actually Word of Glory healing was increased by 40%, and Light of the Titans healing was increased by 40%. The Light of the Titans buff, not necessarily so huge, although it could be helpful in raid or like if dungeons where there are a lot of bleeds and magical debuffs that are going out. Otherwise, it's probably not a must take. But the Word of Glory healing helps a ton. So we had originally kind of put Pally down in maybe lower B tier, but this buff actually does move it up into A tier, competing with Blood DK. In our last tier list, we actually had it above Blood DK, and then Blood DK got buffed, and Pally took a big hit from the 40% HP adjustment. Really, it was the hardest hit tank, and that still remains true. But this buff to Word of Glory actually kind of brings it back in line with where it needs to be. This was where it was really struggling. You pick up that Sentinel talent, you're extremely tanky during Sentinel, and you can get that down to about between a minute and minute 20 cooldown with using your Righteous Protector talent, which is good. And let's see, just talking about the things that it does is I feel like I'm repeating myself because I recorded it once, but you guys are only hearing this for the first time. So they do have some of the better mob control in the game. They can handle more interrupts than any other tank with Avenger Shield plus their own interrupt and Divine Toll. They have great utility in the sense of their immunities with Bop and Sack, very useful. They have an AoE stop with Blinding Light, as well as, of course, Hammer of Justice for a single target stun. You've got Poison and Disease cleanse that you can opt into. They do decent upfront mitigation through their block, and even with magic damage, they handle it pretty well compared to some of the other tanks. Not as good as a Demon Hunter for sure, and not as good as a Warrior, but they are able to block magic damage, which helps, and their parry is pretty strong as well. Again, not as good as a Warrior though, which is why it's really not up there in S tier. And really where it had struggled was in between your Sentinel pulls. You're going to have a pull in which you really don't have much going on. You can use Kings, which is a great defensive, but outside of that, you're going to feel pretty weak, and the self-healing really just wasn't there to kind of keep yourself up. You were almost not quite to that monk level of squishiness, but yeah, you really felt like if you were going to die, you hit a pretty dangerous spot in between Sentinel when you don't have Kings, and that falls off. And now you're kind of squishy, and you're kind of relying on yourself basically keep your Shield of the Righteous up, as well as using Word of Glory to fill in to help your HP bar. And that was where they were feeling weak. Obviously, this adjustment just got announced, so we haven't really been able to be in there and test it. But essentially, this counteracts that 40% HP adjustment and gives another 40% right back into its healing. And so Word of Glory is going to feel like a great button to push again, and will probably top off your HP bar when you press it, especially when it crits. So yeah, and where I had Pally down there in B tier, we're gonna move it up to A tier for this video.
All right. So that kind of brings us to Blood DK. So last time we had Blood DK kind of at the top of A, and it's going to fall in A for us again this time. They were the tank that was probably the least affected by health pool changes, as almost all of their important healing comes from Death Strike, which is damage taken based and not health based. They saw a modest nerf to their Death Strike healing, but in practice, you can't really tell that it's changed, and they've received some buffs to their damage. So overall, the spec's in as good, if not a better place than it was when we made this list a few weeks ago. When they remain an incredibly strong tank, and if they are played well, they can be competitive. However, Blood is a very unforgiving spec right now. So you have to be very thorough you have to play it very correctly in managing your runes, your runic power, and making sure that you're maintaining your buffs, as well as making sure that you're inside your death and decay in order for you to have sufficient damage and survivability. If any one of those things starts to fall off, then blood stocks start to plummet a whole lot. And one of the big problems is that you can make a mistake when your rotation drop buffs, and then you don't necessarily feel it until about 10 seconds later, and then you're like, oh wait, now I'm just dead. There's just
you fall over really quickly.
There's just
I can confirm that.
Yeah, Judd's been playing some blood.
I've been playing it a lot. It's fun, but yeah, sometimes you fall over and you realize, oh, I should have been able to prevent that. You'll realize that you made the mistake when you die. That's what's great about the tank, honestly.
Right, because you are still probably you are probably still the most self-sufficient tank with your healing, and that does go a long way. However, it is very unforgiving, and it's especially at the beginning of the season when people are becoming more familiar with the rotation and when they're learning the dungeons and getting really used to it. That's going to really struggle. Or that's going to be something that people really struggle with early. It does still have incredible utility. There are a couple places where the grips are really going to be useful. For example, Naku defensive in the early area with the Cinchuars. Having those grips on all the archer mobs that don't like to move is really, really helpful. And I've said this before. I said it last time. I'll probably say it again. Like, if you're someone who is going to play 20, 30 or more keys a week on Blood DK, you're probably going to get some really, really good performance out of it to rival Vengeance or Prot Warriors and kind of be on about that same level. If, however, you're someone who's wants to come in and tank 4 or 5 keys a week and try to push KSM and maybe do Blood as like an off-spec after DPSing in a raid, Blood's going to feel a little bit rough for you early on. It's not going to perform as well as some of those other tanks that are a lot more forgiving. So we still think that overall in skilled hands, it's going to land in about that A tier, and it'll stay there for now for us. But
that's a good transition into our last tank, Brewmaster Monk, because it's similar to Blood DK as far as number of keys that you run on it. It does seem to have the highest or the lowest skill floor, the highest skill ceiling.
But it just got buffed, right? Big buffs.
But it just got buffed, so it's still going to be down in B. It's still the bottom tank right now with one caveat. It does the most AoE damage of any tank, and I think we even said that in the last video. It's the hardest one, I think, to put in a tier list because that is a pretty awesome trick. Being able to just do a ton of AoE damage. Usually push groups are willing to play around that. See Survival Hunters and Destro Warlocks last season, mainly the Survival Hunters. Destro Warlocks are just great all around, but at least they were in Shadowlands. As for Brewmaster Monks, they still leave a little bit to be desired on the defensive front. But Blizzard realizes this, I think, and they are starting to, these last rounds of buffs, they had a Gift of the Ox healing, as well as Celestial Brew increased shielding, which is great. Where they suffer is still going to be that magic damage. They're really the worst at taking magic damage. There's super reduced stagger from that, so you're just taking full hits of magic damage, and they don't really have much to mitigate against that. That being said, they have a lot of buttons that you can use up front. You have to be extremely proactive with your defenses when playing this spec, and so it requires kind of knowing the dungeon ahead of time, which if we're moving into new dungeon pools every season, at least going into Dragonflight, completely new dungeons, if I should even say that honestly, because 4 of them are old dungeons, but going in there with new dungeons, you're going to have to there's a little bit of a learning curve there as far as figuring out where your damage is coming in and being able to stay on top of that. They do still have great party utility, really some of the best, maybe up there with Paladin and whatnot, as far as your Ring of Peace, your Paralyze, good AoE stop with Leg Sweep. They do bring Poison and Disease Cleanse as well. And kind of lots of good options for party utility. You can give your party a little extra avoidance. There's some forgiveness in the class tree to move talents around to kind of help out your group in whatever situation. However, you are still, I think, just the survivability is the one thing that's going to hold Brewmaster back. And it really kind of, when we're talking about Blood DK, it's falling over. That's not quite the level that Brewmaster is going to fall over. It'll fall over in lower keys if you're not on top of your game.
All right. Well, that's going to do it for our tier list. We had the goal of hitting 1,000 subscribers by January, and we're getting really close to that. So if you like the content, you're willing to help us out and drop a subscribe, we really appreciate it. And we'll be getting our raid tier list out in the next day or two as well. So keep an eye out for that.
Yeah, buff Pally.
All right. We'll see you on the next one.
All right, see you in the next video.